Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. So let me start by apologizing for missing the class yesterday and like first moving it online and then canceling it altogether. Basically, my dad had an operation and it was an eye operation, and so he couldn't really see. But there was some mishap at the hospital, and basically I needed to take care of him for a couple of days. Um, and he's fine, but I just ended up having to stay around him because he can't see, at least as long as he hadn't removed the eye covering. Um, and so I thought that I would be able to give the class online, but I ultimately he just needed more help than I could cater to, so I had to cancel the class. But in any case, hopefully this will give us an opportunity to just kind of go a little bit fast. I'll go over some of this material. This material is important, so we really need to discuss it. So I'm hoping that you guys will get a chance to watch this before our class next time. Um, okay, let's get started. So what we're going to do is I'm going to try to get through all of section 4, and let's see if I cover more than section 4 only. So remember that Heidegger had now switched to talking about knowing ourselves, or having how do we experience ourselves and how do we experience others, right? And the first thing that he had started with is by asking this question, who is Dasein? And then he had pointed out that he thinks that we're immediately drawn to this idea that I am a thinking thing, right? But he just points out that the I is an indexical, which just refers to you, so it's empty, it doesn't say what you are. And so to fill out what you are, so I am, what am I, right? It's not just that simple to just say I'm a thinking thing. That he thinks treats us as present at hand objects, as psychophysical things. But in fact, he thinks that the way we should fill in this I, what you are, is through looking at experience. And so he starts out by pointing out that the I is not, a subject of experience. Rather, we're going to try to understand it existentially through the lived experience. And then the first thing that we find out over there is that we notice that the first encounter with others is and that's, remember, we said that this is kind of weird because instead of talking about our encounter with ourselves, right, he's not starting with self-experience, he's starting with the experience of the others, right, is that he says, since we live in this work world, right, this world where we just engage practically with things, we encounter others in this practical engagement. And so the first encounter with others is others as producers and consumers of this world of equipment. As he puts it, right, we very often identify others in terms of what they do, so the way that they practically engage with the world. We say this guy is a cab driver, right? But in what sense is he a cab driver? We're saying who he is by saying what he does. We also describe ourselves in this way, Heidegger points out. So our description of others and of ourselves is filled in the same way. So you say, I am a philosophy professor, if I'm introducing myself. But then I'm filling the I with an activity that I engage in. So contrast this with saying I'm a thinking thing, where you've just abstracted away from your practical engagement. So now Heidegger says that this is our first encounter with others, but then he starts talking about other ways in which we encounter others. First of all, he notes that by talking about others, he doesn't mean others, everybody except you. You also belong to them. You're one of them. And so I'll come back to this point eventually. In a way, I'm just recapping here because I just want you guys to be on board with what's happening. So then the other thing that he points out is that we are constantly in a state of solicitude towards others, right? Where solicitude is like a concern with, where we stand in relation to them. So remember that for Heidegger, you're never by yourself. You start out with the others, and if you're going to get away from the others, it's only through this deficient mode of like, I put myself in my room or I close up the house, right? And now I'm far away from the others. But ultimately, I'm always with the others. So my being is being with others. And now Heidegger says that, in this kind of being with one another, we stand in this relationship of being either for one another. So, like, there's the people that you're close to, then there's the people, or you could be for one another, you could be against one another. So, you can be like, oh, we're not them, right? Or you could simply be in a mode of indifference to one another, as when you walk down the street and the others are just there with you, but you're indifferent to them. So these are also modes of encountering the other. Um, or others. And now we got to the last part, which is about the they or the one, and this concept of distentiality, which is where I'm going to start kind of going through the quotation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to alter this video so that you can see the slides at the same time as I'm speaking, and hopefully that will work. But okay, so in fact, I'll just reread the distentiality one just so that you guys have a clear picture of it in mind, right? It says, being with one another is based proximally and often exclusively upon what is a matter of common concern in such being. So our relations to one another mostly revolve around the things that matter to us, as a common object of concern. You and your friends are friends mostly because of the things that you talk about, which are an object of common concern to both of you. He says, now knowing ourselves is grounded in this relationship of being with others. So in what sense? He says, in one's concern with what one has taken hold of, whether with, for, or against the others. So in your concern with what you have taken hold of, there is a constant care as to the way one differs from them, whether this difference is merely one that is to be evened out, whether one's own Dasein has lagged behind the others and wants to catch up in relationship to them, or whether one's Dasein already has some priority over them and sets out to keep them suppressed. So, well, maybe actually I just finish it. So the care about this distance between them is disturbing to being with one another, though this disturbance is one that is hidden from it. If we may express this existentially, such being with one another has the character of distentiality. The more inconspicuous this kind of being is to everyday Dasein itself, all the more stubbornly and primordially does it work itself out. So then, what's the idea? The idea is that Heidegger's saying, in whatever we engage in, we are, in some sense, measured up in relation to the other. What he's not saying, somebody is measuring us. He's saying that internal to our idea of ourselves is a measurement to others. So, like I pointed out, for you to be, a good student is just for you to stand in. What does it mean for you to be good as a student? You do it in your way, and now its goodness or badness lies in the relation it stands to others, right? Whether you are a good student because you do better than the other students or not. Similarly, when you think about what was the example that I wanted to give? So imagine that you say, I'm into rock music or whatever, right? To be into rock music is just, what does that mean? People listen to rock music, all of them listen to rock music. So for you to be a fan of rock music is just for you to stand in a particular relation to it in relation to the others. Like, others don't listen to rock music as much as you do. So that's what makes you, a fan of rock music. In a way, these concepts that we use are concepts that include a measurement in relation to the others, whether one is behind them, ahead of them, even with them, and so on. So, like I pointed out, we can think of this is distentiality, right? And you can think of it as like we're all tied together, we're socially entangled in the sense that we're all, or you can imagine it as we're all tied together with rubber bands, and we're trying to keep these rubber bands from being stretched out too much, so to speak. Okay. So that's another way in which we encounter the others, distentiality. But now Heidegger introduces the most important concept for all of his discussion, and this is the they or the one. So, like I said, this is a concept. In German, it's das Man, which doesn't translate exactly into an English term, but sometimes it's translated as the they, other times it's translated as the one. Okay? So he says, but this distentiality which belongs to being with is such that Dasein, as everyday being with one another, stands in subjection to others. So this distentiality which belongs to being with stands in subjection to others. It itself is not. Its being has been taken away by the others. Dasein's everyday possibilities of being are for the others to dispose of as they please. These others, moreover, are not definite others. On the contrary, any other can represent them. What is decisive is just that inconspicuous domination by others which has already been taken over unawares from Dasein as being with. One belongs to the others oneself and enhances their power. The others, whom one thus designates in order to cover up the fact of one's belonging to them essentially oneself, are those who proximally and for the most part are there in everyday being with one another. The who is not this one, not that one, not oneself, not some people, and not the sum of them all. The who is the neuter, the they. So what's Heidegger saying over here? I mean, maybe I'll say a little bit about it and go on and then just say something about it more generally. But Heidegger is saying that insofar as we live within this distentiality, as long as the ways, the concepts, the ideas that we use to understand ourselves are ones which relate us to the others, then in a sense, our being has been taken away from us, and it's been taken away from us by the others. He says, Dasein's everyday possibilities are for the others to dispose of as they please. So, first of all, he's saying that others have the power to take over our possibilities. And now, just before we understand this, let's just see who the others are. The others are not definite others, so they're not any particular people, it's not like that group over there. It's not a conspiracy, about some group, right? It's not some others, right? Any other can represent them, he tells us, okay? And in fact, specifically what's important about the others, right, is that it's inconspicuous. It's inconspicuous as in it's like not noticeable, this domination that happens. The others also, he says, covers up the fact of one's belonging to them essentially oneself. So the others are not the others except you. You're part of them, So here, when he says there's a domination of the others, it's like there's a domination of all of you, by the others, for each of you, by the others, but you yourself are one of them. So, anyway, I'll come back to this example in just a second. He says, so there they include you too. And then who are they? Well, they are those who proximally and for the most part are there in everyday being with one another. So who are they really? They're the ones who are around you most of the time. In some sense your society, in some sense, your friend, your peer group, in some sense, the culture that's around you. That's what the others are. They're the culture at large, right? I'll come back to this. So now, the who, he says, so who is Dasein? And his answer is, Dasein is das Man, right? Dasein is the one or is the they. That's who it is primarily. So the who is not this one, not that one, not oneself, not some people, and not some of them, not the sum of them all. The who is the neuter, the they. So we have to now hear more about what this they is supposed to be. But I just said that we are dominated by them in some sense, and they include us. So now the question is to try to understand, in what sense does Heidegger mean that our being has been taken away from us by the others, which, remember, include us. So look at the next slide. He says, we have shown earlier how in the environment which lies closest to us, the public environment already is ready to hand, and it's also a matter of concern. So he says, we've already talked about how we live in a world of common concern and in a world of equipment, right? So he says now, in utilizing public means of transport and in making use of information services such as the newspaper, every other is like the next. This being with one another dissolves one's own Dasein completely into the kind of being of the others, in such a way, indeed, that the others, as distinguishable and explicit, vanish more and more. In this inconspicuousness and unascertainability, the real dictatorship of the they is unfolded. We take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as they take pleasure. We read, see, and judge about literature and art as they see and judge. Likewise, we shrink back from the great mass as they shrink back. We find shocking what they find shocking. The they, which is nothing definite and which all are, though not as the sum, prescribes the kind of being of everydayness. Well, I mean, it helps here to just think about, some more practical scenarios. But here's what Heidegger is saying. He's saying, insofar as our being is being with one another in a practical world of common concern, and insofar as we engage in this sort of communal living, utilizing public means of transport, making use of information services. Think about everybody uses the internet, this generates like a particular way of thinking or of categorizing things in reality. Things are so because one says so. So, in other words, think about your entry first into language. When you're learning new words, your mom says, "Okay, that's a cat." Okay, now you can ask the question, "Why is that a cat?" And that's a cat because it meows. Okay, but why is it a cat? Because it meows. Well, it's because, cats are felines and so on. But you can keep asking why. And ultimately, the parent, to the child will have to say, that's a cat because that's what people call them. Right, that's what that's what the word cat means. That's what one says of those things, and that's this is the way one speaks when one is talking about stuff like that. So notice that in saying this, I have to appeal to this idea of what one says or what one does, or what they say or what they do. And this is really what Heidegger is talking about when he's talking about the they or the one. So I told you guys in Arabic, it's also you have a concept like that, which is الواحد, الواحد ما بيعمل هيك. If you say that, you're saying the one does not do this. Who is the one? الواحد ما بيستعمل الكلمة هيك. So now you've given a prescription about how one uses a word by appealing to what one does. But who is one? This is exactly what Heidegger is talking about. He's saying that within the categories that we enter into, so you're born into the world, and now there's these concepts or these ideas that you get from culture. Ideas like the idea of a cat, the idea of a tree, the idea of a dog, the idea of clouds, all of the concepts that come from either the English language for you guys or the Arabic language or French or whatever languages that you know. These things categorize a reality, and they categorize it as one does, right? And now you are subjected to this in the sense that your subjectivity has to be fit into what one is. One can be a philosopher and one can be an artist. One can become a good student and one can avoid doing bad things. But this is only because these things have been interpreted in some way by the categories of the they. These interpretations, you can't be some things that are not interpreted by the they. For instance, you can't choose to be a flubu no matter how much you'd like to be a flubu, because there's simply no such thing as being a flubu. It doesn't mean anything. Why doesn't it mean anything? Because one doesn't use the word in this way. So the word has no meaning because it hasn't been given meaning by, the others. So now, if I'm just going to try to tie it for you guys a bit more with Husserl, what Heidegger is saying is that the horizons which interpret our experience for us, we were vague on where they came from in Husserl. I kept saying they're concepts, but Husserl actually thinks that they're ideas that we construct in our minds in some sense. Heidegger is saying that that's not the case. Ideas are not ideas you construct in your mind. Ideas are ways of articulating reality that come from the others. You think as one thinks, you speak as one speaks, and you value as one values. Because the way you value, the way you think, and the way you speak is filtered through their categories, which are imposed on you from the very beginning, since you're born into the practical world of being with others, where things have been thought of in a particular way and which you just absorbed. You just absorb the way they think about these things. You think cats are the things that meow or furry and cute, but that's because one thinks that cats are the things that are furry, meow, and cute or whatever. Okay, so now he's saying, think about it, in terms of, he's saying, in utilizing public means of transport and in making use of information services such as the newspaper or the internet, every other is like the next. We all think with these same categories. We have the same horizons. The world means to us the same thing. It's what it means to one. And one is what you are, who is Dasein? Dasein is first and foremost one. You are what one is. So he says it dissolves, this type of being dissolves your own Dasein completely into the kind of being of the others, which now it becomes even hard to distinguish yourself from them. You are what one is, you think as they do, and so on. So now, yeah, okay, fine, you might say, oh, I'm into rock music, and take that as an object of personal pride, but in fact, you're just generic. You are what one does when one is into rock music. And now Heidegger points out that this sort of domination by the they is inconspicuous. It means it's not noticeable and unascertainable. It's like you can't tell whether it's really happening or not. It's almost like that from the perspective of the subject. But it's because it's like that you see the real dictatorship of the they, right? There's a dictatorship because now it defines what are possible ways of thinking about reality, seeing reality, valuing reality, and so on. So he says, we take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as they take pleasure. We read, see, and judge about literature and art as they see and judge. Likewise, we shrink back from the great mass as they shrink back. We find shocking what they find shocking. So look at the examples he gives. You take pleasure and enjoy yourselves as they take pleasure. So, here you are. It's Saturday night. You're going to go have fun. What are you going to do? Oh, you're going to go to a club, Oh, but, that's what one does, right? One goes to a club to enjoy themselves on Saturday night. Or one goes for dinner. Or one goes for... And now you just live that out. You enjoy and take pleasure in the way that they enjoy and take pleasure, in the way one enjoys and takes pleasure. You read, see, and judge about literature and art as they see and judge. What are you reading? Oh, Harry Potter, why? Why are you reading Harry Potter? Because that's what one is reading, That's because this is the thing that just came out, So again, you move towards these. So now you say, oh, but yeah, I won't read Harry Potter. I'm going to read this really obscure book. Yeah, you read that obscure book as one reads these obscure books. Look at the next one he says. He says, likewise, we shrink back from the great mass as they shrink back. So even this gesture where you're like, yeah, but I'm not like them. This is a gesture that one does, that it itself is generic. Everyone says, I'm not like the others. We find shocking what they find shocking, and so on. The they, which isn't anything definite, and which we all are, but not as the sum of us, right, prescribes the kind of being of everydayness. What Heidegger is saying is that in our self-experience and in our experience of the world and of others, we understand the world as one understands the world. We think of the world as one thinks of the world. Now he's going to say a lot more about this, but let's move on so that we can see what more he says. He says, the they has its own ways in which to be. So there is a way that one does things, and one has a way in which it is. you could say الواحد بيعمل هول الأشياء وما بيعمل هوديك الأشياء وبيفكر بهول الطرقات بس مش بهول الطرقات or something like that. And so now the they has its own ways in which to be. That tendency of being with, which we have called distentiality, is grounded in the fact that being with one another concerns itself as such with averageness, which is an existential characteristic of the they. The they, in its being, essentially makes an issue of this. Thus, the they maintains itself factically in the averageness of that which belongs to it, of that which it regards as valid and which it does not, and of that to which it grants success and that to which it denies it. In this averageness with which it prescribes what can and may be ventured, it keeps watch over everything exceptional that thrusts itself to the fore. Every kind of priority gets noiselessly suppressed. Overnight, everything that is primordial gets glossed over as something that has long well been known. Everything gained by a struggle becomes just something to be manipulated. Every secret loses its force. This care of averageness reveals, in turn, an essential tendency of Dasein, which we may call the leveling down of all possibilities of being. So, what's Heidegger saying here? He's saying the they has its own ways to be, and so now distentiality is, in a sense, measuring ourselves in relation to what one should be or what they should be, So you're a good student if one is doing in such and such ways in class, for instance. But now Heidegger points out that this type of being with one another, which the they articulates, has this possibility which he calls, or this feature which he calls averageness. What's averageness? Well, averageness is the fact that the they defines things in a way that is common to everyone, and so it has to average out what people are. What one does not necessarily coincide with what any specific actual person really does. It's, in some sense, an averaged out version of all of these things. And in this averageness, it decides that some things are valid and some things are not valid, some things are successful, some things are not successful. So, for instance, the way one uses the word cat and the way one uses the word dog, and the way one uses forks, and the way one uses combs. I keep saying one and way in a reversed order. But in any case, these ways that we do or say things, these are ultimately right, So these are, there's not another criteria for why we do it this way. We just regard this as valid and that's not valid. We say that one meets a particular standard, one doesn't. Now I'll talk about this idea of norms later on, but that's basically what it's saying. He's saying that the they articulates norms for the use of categories, where categories are like concepts or ideas about the world. So in other words, there's a right way to use the ideas that are there to describe the world and which, as a result, define this world, but also define it as that's the right way the world should be thought about. So now, in this averageness, which is supposed to there's another sense in which it's average, which he talks about at the end, this idea of leveling down, is that basically these categories have to be able to fit everyone and to be usable by everyone and applicable for everyone, right? Because they're supposed to be these kind of generic things, right, that apply to all of us, they apply to one. So now this type of being, right, he says, in this averageness with which it prescribes what can and may be ventured, so it prescribes what can and may be ventured because it articulates all the ways of thinking about reality. The they produces the categories or the horizons of meaning which tell us what the world means and which tell us what is meaningful and what isn't meaningful. It prescribes this, and it keeps watch over everything exceptional that thrusts itself to the fore. So it keeps watch over everything new or exceptional, right, which shows up. And then what it does is it suppresses it, noiselessly suppresses it. So every kind of priority gets noiselessly suppressed. Overnight, overnight, everything that is primordial, so that is original, gets glossed over. Glossed over, it means like covered up as something that, oh, everybody knows it. And everything gained by a struggle becomes something just to be manipulated. Every secret loses its force. These are the things that he says. So what's he talking about here? He's saying that he's kind of describing the way that they operates. So remember, the they is all of us, okay? Let's say you think about a particular way to be or a particular idea. Somebody initially used the concept of a hashtag. Somebody originally discovered the tie-dye shirt. The tie-dye shirt is the shirt with these colors in like a fractal fashion. Somebody was the first person to come up with the idea of E equals mc square and so on. So now these ideas which emerge out of us, and remember, each of us is part of the they. These categories come up, so a horizon comes up, right? And now the moment it comes up through a struggle. So the person who, comes up with a tie-dye shirt, one day they're washing their shirt, whatever, they do something, and now the shirt comes out colored in this nice fractal way. This was an original discovery. It was an experience that an individual person had, and theirs was original because they somehow grasped something that got them to produce this. When Einstein discovers E equals mc square, he, through his own experience and through his own thinking about the world, uncovers this formula for understanding a certain aspect of reality. Similarly, for every concept, the concept of a hashtag, whoever first used it, came up with it on their own. But now, what does the they do? The moment this concept comes up, it thrusts itself to the fore, right, as something exceptional. It gets noiselessly suppressed. So now the guy wears the tie-dye shirt, goes out into the streets, right? And then other people see it. And now they say, oh, I like that shirt. I'm going to go make one, And so now the next day you come out and there's 300 people wearing that shirt. Now, the thing which was original gets glossed over as something that has long been well known. And the thing gained by a struggle becomes just something to be manipulated. Now there's, this company that produces these tie-dye shirts. E equals mc square. Einstein says it, writes it out in a paper. This scientist reads it. He understands it, maybe, or she understands it. She tells it to her husband. Her husband is not, does not know anything about physics. He's an artist. So he says, oh, E equals mc squared. So he goes, tells his artist friends, E equals mc squared. That's, the relationship between energy and mass. I don't really understand it, but that's what it is. So now very quickly, the idea E equals mc square, or the tie-dye shirt, or the hashtag spreads out in culture, and it spreads out in this very thinned out average form where it doesn't have to be understood, it can just be passed around. Suddenly everybody is talking about this thing, and suddenly everybody is doing this thing. It becomes something that has long well been known. It's no longer something original. The they, is on the lookout for all the ways of thinking and articulating being, and anytime a new way of articulating being shows up, it makes sure that this gets averaged out so that, in a way, everybody can think it. I have to say more about this, but let's move on for now. Distentiality, averageness, and leveling down as ways of being for the they constitute what we know as publicness. Publicness proximally controls every way in which the world and Dasein gets interpreted, and it is always right. Not because there's some distinctive and primary relationship of being in which it is related to things, or because it avails itself of some transparency on the part of Dasein with which it has explicitly appropriated, but because it is insensitive to every difference of level and of genuineness, and thus never gets to the heart of the matter. By publicness, everything gets obscured, and what has thus been covered up gets passed off as something familiar and accessible to everyone. So Now, Heidegger tells us that in this being with one another as the they, through distentiality, averageness, and leveling down, this type of being is the type of being that he's going to call publicness. And publicness is, he says, controls every way in which the world and Dasein gets interpreted, and it is always right. So, this is what I've just been saying, that the way in which culture, in which the they has articulated reality, it controls every way in which reality has been articulated or interpreted, and it's always right. Now, Heidegger tells us, why is it always right? Not because it has some very special, real, correct, deep relationship to the things themselves, right? Not because Dasein has understood it really deeply, but rather it's the opposite. It's because it's so superficial, but because it is insensitive to every difference of level, and insensitive to every difference of genuineness, and it never gets to the heart of the matter. It's like as soon as everybody is just walking around, running around saying, oh, E equals MC square, E equals MC square, it's not because they don't understand it. It's just because they repeat it. Just think about how many of you knew the phrase, I think, therefore I am. Whether or not you understood what it means to say, I think, therefore I am, you knew it. And you knew it in this superficial way. This is what publicness is. And this, Heidegger says, is the way that we understand things first and foremost, one understands you understands things as one understands things, and one understands them in this very thinned out way. By publicness, Heidegger tells us, everything gets obscured. It's like it becomes hazy, right? And what's been covered up, so the deep truth behind an idea, right, gets covered up as something familiar and accessible to everyone. So the moment you read, I think, therefore I am, you're like, hey, I know this, whether you know it or not. But bare familiarity with the categories of culture produces this illusion that one understands what is going on. In fact, one understands what is going on according to what they say, For instance, one knows that Lebanon is corrupt, and one knows that something needs to be done, and one knows that the politicians are to blame, and one knows whatever. These are not, insights. These are just generic pieces of knowledge. One knows that one should not condemn, or that one should condemn Russia. One knows that men and women are equal. There's ways in which reality has been thought out, which are supposedly obvious and which are supposedly one's own, but in fact they're just generic things in culture that are ways that culture has articulated itself, and as a result which you've inherited, so you just think as one does. Okay. So, from here, Heidegger tells us, the they is there alongside everywhere, but in such a manner that it has always stolen away whenever Dasein presses for a decision. So, the they is there everywhere. Yet, because, and he said something else, but bear with me. Yet, because the they presents every judgment and decision as its own, it deprives the particular Dasein of its answerability. The they can, as it were, manage to have them constantly invoking it. It can be answerable for everything most easily, because it's not someone who needs to vouch for anything. It was always the they who did it, and yet it can be said that it has been no one. In Dasein's everydayness, the agency through which most things come about is one which we must say that it was no one. So let me just read on. Actually, no, let me stop here. So what's he saying here? He's saying the they is there alongside everywhere. So in other words, we live amongst these categories of culture and amongst the others who reinforce these categories of culture. We ourselves reinforce them too, because we also articulate ourselves in the way that culture articulates itself. So now Heidegger says it's there alongside everywhere, but in a way where it's like it's stolen away. It's like hidden itself every time you end up confronted with a decision. The they presents every judgment and decision as its own, since what one is and what one does is kind of the default. In a way, it can answer for everything. So you can say one commits murder. Yes, one does commit murder. Sometimes one commits murder. One commits rape. Yes, sometimes one commits rape. Sometimes one is good. Yes, sometimes one is good. So it's kind of decided everything on its own. And so now what it offers Dasein. So the question is, you might think, like Heidegger's been saying, this they thing is kind of disturbing and it like, it takes over your subjectivity in some sense. Why are you a part of it, and why do you strengthen it, and why don't you just like oppose it in some sense, right? And now he's giving us one thing that it does, which is that it takes away a burden from the individual Dasein. So when you come to make a decision, it is ready to answer for you and to take responsibility for you, so that you don't have to take responsibility yourself. So here you are, you've been given the assignment. You go and you cheat on this assignment and you don't get caught. And now when you cheat on the assignment, you justify this to yourself by saying, well, sometimes one has to cheat, And yeah, sometimes one cheats, sometimes one has to cheat. You can say that, right? So it can take over your responsibility for you. You say, I didn't do anything different, I just did what one does, right? Similarly, one sometimes starts a war, one sometimes commits rape, one sometimes commits murder. It can take over anything. It can vouch for anything. The best deeds that you perform and the worst deeds that you can perform, you don't have to take responsibility for them yourself, because you can say, I just did what one does, right? And so they can, he says, manage to have us, constantly invoking it, as if saying, yeah, but that's not what one does, that is what one does. It can be answerable for everything. It will answer for everything most easily. Why? Well, because it's not someone who needs to vouch for anything. Yeah, one commits murder, but this is not going to get anybody into trouble. Not any specific person. Not all of the murderers who committed murder in human history. So you can always say, yeah, but sometimes one cheats, and now nobody has to take responsibility. You don't take responsibility, but nobody else does as well. Nobody needs to, it's answerable for everything most easily, because it's not someone who needs to vouch for anything. It was always they who did it, and yet it can be said that it has been no one. In Dasein's everydayness, the agency through which most things come about is one in which we say it was no one. So, in other words, he's saying that in our everyday experience, in fact, the majority of decisions are enacted in this way. You say, you wake up in the morning because your phone alarm rang. Well, why does the phone alarm mean you have to wake up? Well, because now this means you have to go to class. Why does it mean that you have to go to class? Because that's what one sets an alarm for, and one has to go to class. So then you don't really think about it. You just say that the alarm rings, you just get up and you walk, as if you have to do this. It's taken over the decision, your free decision to do something right now by articulating a way that reality is for you. So. Thus, the particular Dasein in its everydayness is disburdened by the they. Not only that, by this disburdening of its being, the they accommodates Dasein, if Dasein has any tendency to take things easily and make them easy. And because the they constantly accommodates the particular Dasein by disburdening it of its being, the they retains and enhances its stubborn dominion. So here Heidegger is saying, because the they will always accommodate you, then in a way, it produces a permanent seduction. The permanent seduction is to never take responsibility for the decisions that you're making in your life. You can always say to yourself, I'm just doing what one does. I didn't behave any differently. And so then you don't have to answer to the fact that you cheated, to the fact that you might have been dishonest. You don't have to critically assess whether you really are a good student, or you just like to think of yourself as one, or you have a cliche concept of what a goodness is, and so on. So in a way, it disburdens you from many decisions. And, maybe it's not clear yet, but as we're going to see, this is a dual function. At one level, the they is neutral, but at another level, it can be negative. Anyway, we'll talk about this more. Let's now just talk. I think I'll do 2 more slides with you guys, and then we'll stop there. Okay, so now Heidegger says, everyone is the other, and no one is himself. The they, which supplies the answer to the who of everyday Dasein, is the nobody to whom every Dasein has already surrendered itself in being among one another. Neither the self of one's own Dasein nor the self of the other has as yet found itself or lost itself, as long as it is in the modes we have mentioned. In these modes, one's way of being is that of inauthenticity and failure to stand by oneself. The self of everyday Dasein is the they self, which we distinguish from the authentic self, that is, from the self which has been taken hold of in its own way. As they self, the particular Dasein has been dispersed into the they, and must first find itself. This dispersal characterizes the subject of that kind of being which we know as concernful absorption in the world we encounter as closest to us. Dasein is for the sake of the they in its everyday manner, and the they itself articulates the referential context of significance. The they is an existential and is a primordial phenomena. It belongs to Dasein's positive constitution. So I probably shouldn't have read all of these all at once, but it's fine. The last 2 are a little bit different than the others. But take now the first one. It says, everyone is the other and no one is himself. The they, which supplies the answer to the who, is the nobody to which every Dasein has already surrendered. What Heidegger is saying here is that, in this sense, no one is themselves, because already the way you think of yourself and the way that you are and the way that you behave and the way that you desire and the way that you hope and you dream and whatever has been articulated by them. Think of you before you acquired human language, right? When you were a baby and your experience was a particular way, it wasn't articulated through their categories. But that's long been gone. And in a way, you can't go back to that. You think of yourself as a student, and a student is what they've thought up as a way of categorizing oneself. You think of yourself as a heterosexual or a homosexual, but that's a way they've thought of this thing they call sexuality. You think of yourself as a, for instance, sexual being, but what's to distinguish sexual from physical from whatever being? Just the fact that they've said it. They think of us as having a sexual being, as this sexual being can take on the mode of, say, heterosexual and homosexual. And now, if you identify in that way, then you have taken over, or you've been taken over by their categories. In fact, now sit down and write a paper of everything that you are. Everything that you are is an idea that they came up with. So you are not yourself. You're what they've articulated as being you. This is what Heidegger means when he says everyone is the other and no one is himself. The they answers the question of who is Dasein. Who are you? Everything that you write down, they answer for it. In that sense, every person is a nobody, right? It's the nobody to whom every Dasein has already surrendered in being amongst one another. Now, I want you to notice that since you've already been born into this world with others through the world of equipment, in a way, you were always not yourself. You were always what they articulated you as being. And this has happened even before you were born, because already before you were born, you were given a name. So you were given a position in culture, and your parents had ideas about what you are and what you should be and what you shouldn't be, and then they embedded these in you. So in that sense, your own being has already been taken over by the others. Um, and he says, as long as we're talking about these modes, in fact, you and the self and the other, so you and the guy next to you or the girl next to you, neither of you is an individual. You're both, what one is at this point. This mode of being, Heidegger calls it inauthenticity, right? So this is inauthentic being. Everyday being is inauthentic. Why is it inauthentic? Because it fails to stand by itself. It's like you are what one is before you are yourself. You don't know how to stand with yourself, and so you live an inauthentic being. Now, I just want to point out that if you look at the very end, right, he says the they is an existential, and as a primordial phenomenon, it belongs to Dasein's positive constitution. So Heidegger is saying that you are what one is, and you've lost yourself. You live in this mode of inauthenticity, but in some sense, this is not something avoidable. You have to be in a mode of inauthenticity insofar as you live with the others and you are one of them. Whether this has to be the only mode that you live in is a different matter. But there's a question about, can you get rid of inauthenticity? On Heidegger's view, the answer is no, you can't. But you can get authenticity in addition to this everyday mode of inauthentic being. So I'll explain all of this more in the next session when we talk about the mechanics of the they, but that's what he's saying here. So now the self of everyday Dasein is the they self. You are what one is, which we distinguish from the authentic self. And what's the authentic self? The self which has taken hold of these categories in its own way. So notice that authenticity is not about exiting the ways in which culture has thought things, but about taking hold of them in a particular way. So then we can skip some of this stuff. And now I just, just to again highlight that this mode of inauthenticity is not something that's avoidable. Notice that Heidegger says Dasein is for the sake of the they in an everyday manner, and the they itself articulates the referential context of significance. What's a referential context of significance? Well, significance is, what things are meaningful, what things have significance. So the context of significance is the context of the meaningful, or the context of the stuff that has any significance, the stuff that is a thing, in some sense. And so now articulates what's referential. Referential is like our capacity to refer, to speak about things. So the things that can be spoken about is the referential context of significance. Heidegger is saying the they is what speaks out the world of possible meanings. This means that what is outside the they is not the stuff, not some meanings that are esoteric or secret or something like that. It means that if the they gives us the whole context of meaning, then what is outside of the they is meaninglessness. If the they articulates the universe of sense, then what is outside of it is the world of nonsense. So then, to exit the they in a naive way, you just like, oh yeah, I'm going to rebel against culture, I'm going to be like opposite to everything. Well, just try to imagine being opposite to everything. So now you don't speak as they speak, you don't speak as one speaks, you don't act as one acts, in every single way. Well, if you don't use words in the way other people use words, either you use them in a way that can be translated to the way the others speak. So maybe I use flubu, I'm a flubu, but flubu just means philosopher. So then I'm really saying I'm a philosopher. So if I define flubu in a way that the they can grasp, then the they will absorb it. So now, yeah, you can be a flubu because everybody can be a flubu. That's what one can be. But imagine I resist this. I'm like, oh no, flubu, it means something, but only I can be it, right? Well, fine, let's say that. Then flubu has no meaning in public language. And if flubu has no meaning in public language, then here's what I'm saying. I'm flubu. What does that mean? Doesn't mean anything in public language. Fine, so now let me just move all of my language into that form, into a form which can't be translated into the they, into the they's articulations. So now I'm just like, you know, but this is nonsense. In fact, if I behave and I speak in a way that nobody behaves and speaks, then I'm simply insane. So one way in which you can exit the they is that you can just lose your mind. And in fact, here, the they still has you because you count as the insane. From your perspective, yes, you've isolated yourself from them, but now nothing that you speak has any meaning. You might say it has meaning for me, but what does it mean? If nobody can, what's to stop you from using flubu to mean philosopher one day and flubu to mean, alcoholic the next day? In fact, there is no standard for what counts as right and wrong because you're the one who sets the standard. So anything you say goes. In this sense, the they was articulating what things mean. That one cannot use the word for philosopher to mean the word for alcoholic because those are two different ideas. That's not, these two ideas are different. That's what one says, what one thinks. Now you no longer have any way of appealing to that. So then you've just gone insane. So then there isn't a mode where you've attained authenticity in a way where you've exited the they. You live amongst them and you are first and foremost them. You are what one is. You are first of all a student at LAU who is Lebanese, who whatever, and you think as they think, and you think as your generation thinks, whoever your peer group are. In a way, you're never apart from them. So you can see how for Heidegger, why he would have started by talking about us, rather by talking about the others instead of talking about us. Because just like you are first of all with them and last of all by yourself, you have to be by yourself, you have to lock yourself up in the room. Initially, you're just with them, right? In the same way, you are first of all what they are before becoming yourself. You first of all live in authenticity. In inauthenticity, you're not yourself. So he says, in terms of the they and as the they, I am given proximally to myself. So in terms of the they, in the concepts that they articulate, and as the they, I am given proximally to myself. Proximally, Dasein is they, and for the most part, it remains so. If Dasein discovers the world in its own way and brings it close, if it discloses to itself its own authentic being, then this discovery of the world and this disclosure of Dasein are always accomplished as a clearing away of concealments and obscurities, as a breaking up of the disguises with which Dasein bars its own way. Authentic being oneself does not rest upon an exceptional condition of the subject, a condition that has been detached from the they. It is rather an existential modification of the they. This is going over some of the things I just said, right? But in a way, it's being said more succinctly. He's saying, remember, again, it might be helpful to think about Husserl. Husserl says the transcendental ego, through its own acts, constitutes the empirical ego. You give yourself horizons. You say, I'm a philosopher, that's one meaning, and so on. In a way, Heidegger's picture is similar, but it's not coming from a transcendental ego, it's coming from the they. The they articulates a way in which you are, and you encounter yourself in that way. You think of yourself as, oh, I'm an intellectual, I'm a good student, I'm the sort of person who's interested in existentialism, and so on, right? And now Heidegger is saying, and this is where, for the most part, Dasein remains. It remains thinking of itself in terms of the categories that have been given to it. But now, if it discovers the world in its own way and discovers itself in its own way, this discovery, so to know the world genuinely in some sense or in a more close way, or to know yourself in a better way, always takes the form of removing disguises, right? Because in a way you live in a fake world, the world that's been given to you by culture, but you identify with it. You think this is you. And so every time you discover yourself better, that takes the form of uncovering one of these disguises which you've put up for yourself in your self encounter. Um, so this is what he means when he says they're always accomplished by a clearing away of concealments and obscurities, as a breaking up of the disguises with which Dasein blocks or bars its own way. But don't mistake this. Heidegger is saying, in the last part, he's saying this authentic being yourself is not an exceptional condition where you've exited from the they. It's rather a modification of your relationship to the they. Okay, so let's stop over here. I mean, I thought I might go for a little bit more, but actually, maybe I'll stop here. I don't know how long this is going to take to upload, and then we'll talk about the rest of this later. So the rest of this is really interesting. So just try to read the text as much as you can before the class. Okay, cheers.